Remy. Thank you to the British Council for supporting this session. Um, you can continue your conversation informally off the stage as well. I'm sure the speakers will be happy to entertain that. But we would like to quickly start the next session. And choreography for stage and film, dance and theater explorations and collaborations in India and abroad. An art think South Asia arts management of Creative Australia's International Arts Leaders Program. In December 2015, he was awarded the Ustad Bismillah Khan Yuva Puraskar for Contemporary Dance by the National Sangeet Natak Academy. He is currently one of the 10 worldwide global connectors for IETM, an international network for contemporary performing arts. Please give us a round of applause for him. Now moving on to Ida, writer and an artist. She has 2 master's degrees in gender studies from the University of Cambridge and in traditions of yoga and meditation from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. She was awarded the title of Yoga Acharya by Sivananda Yoga Vedanta Center. He is the co-author of several Ghosh yoga practice manuals and has edited and published historic manuscripts. She makes her home in Minnesota, USA, but travels all over the world to teach practical yoga, history, and philosophy, and to perform music. She is an award-winning violinist and vocalist. Please give us a round of applause for her as well. And last but not the least, we have Sudhir Chandra with us. Sudhir was formerly Senior Fellow, Center for Social Studies, Surat, Gujarat, and a visiting professor at the Institute for Study of Languages and Cultures of Asia and Africa, Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. He is the author of Gandhi, An Impossible Possibility, Enslaved Daughters, Colonialism, Law and Women's Rights, and Continuing Dilemmas, Understanding Social Consciousness, among other works. I would like to hand over the session now to Vikram.
Is this on? Yeah. Thank you for those introductions and welcome to this session. It's called Forgotten Foremothers, and we're going to be discussing 2 books about reconstructing actually the lives and times of 2 remarkable women written by 2 remarkable authors, and we really owe it to them that we are actually talking about these women today. And just to give you an idea of who these women are, I'm going to begin by reading a little bit of the blurb of each of the books. This is on Rukhmabai, an outcome of research spanning decades. Sudhir Chandra's authentic and perceptive biography shines brilliant new light on this extraordinary but little-known life of a rebel doctor who dared to challenge the norms of her time and left behind a formidable legacy. The radical view she proposed of women's freedom is yet to be fully realized. And for Reba Rakshit, strong woman Reba Rakshit, a captivating account of a daredevil who courted controversies and movie stars with equal ease, a woman who dared to dream and had immense courage, steely determination, and enough ambition to fulfill it. The stunt master who worked shoulder to shoulder with men to give her country its first strong woman. She was the first Indian woman to lift an elephant on her chest. But the circus beauty queen was wearing a crown of thorns until one day she decided to take matters into her own hands. And what that means, to know what that means, I'm going to have to buy the book and read it. So, but I would like to begin by really asking both of you about the process and the research for putting this book together, because you're graphing the life of 2 women on whom there's very little material. They are not women who are that history has already celebrated or who have had much written on them. You're also detailing 2 very different eras in 2 very different contexts in India. Post-independence for Reba Rakshit and the late 1800s into the early 1900s in Mumbai, Surat, and Rajkot for Rukhmabai. And what is really interesting about both the books is that it's not written as a historical document. They are storytelling. So therefore, the tone of both of them comes out of who these 2 women were, I feel. And how do you, what is the process of actually arriving at that? What is the place for imagination to fill in the gaps? How much liberties can you take? When do you decide where to draw the line that this may have happened, it's plausible enough, I can put it in the book? And also, when you're painting the picture of that context, you're also referring to several other women of that time. So, just a little introduction into your process. Shall I begin with you?
Friends, it was in 1977. You can calculate how many years have since passed. I was working on a paper on the first Indian National Social Conference, which was organized in 1887. As a good researcher, I decided to begin reading contemporary Indian newspapers from the 1st of January 1887 to see as to when the first mention of the proposed National Social Conference figured in any newspaper. I had reached March 1887 when I read an editorial, a small editorial in a weekly edited by a remarkable Indian, Behramji Malbari, called The Indian Spectator. And this little editorial mentioned a woman who was married when she was 11. For the next 11 years, for one reason or another, or on one pretext or another, she did not live with her husband. Finally, the husband, out of sheer frustration, filed a case of restitution of conjugal rights in the Bombay High Court. And this woman fought the case and told the court at one stage that if the court's judgment would go against her, which she knew it would, she would not obey the court's verdict. She would rather submit herself to the maximum penalty admissible under the law, which was, and we are talking of 1887, and it's a woman. The maximum punishment meant 6 months imprisonment and forfeiture of property. Now, this Hindu woman says, I will not obey the court's verdict. I would go to jail and forego my property. And please remember, Gandhi is nowhere on the scene. Satyagraha is not known. Passive resistance is not known. When I read this editorial, I just couldn't believe what I had read. So I reread the editorial and I ordered all the newspapers and periodicals which the Nehru Memorial Library had for that period. And after reading everything pertaining to this case, I went to the National Archives of India and ordered all possible files on this woman's case. Now, you can imagine that I had by now forgotten the Indian National Social Conference. I was working on this woman. And luckily for me, two lawyers, Rajiv Dhawan, you may or may not have heard of him. He was one of the lawyers who fought the Ayodhya case. He lost it, but it was a shame that the Ayodhya judgment was delivered by the Supreme Court. Legally speaking, it doesn't hold. So Rajiv Dhawan, luckily I met him, and he said, oh, you're working on this. Would you like to? So he offered me everything that was possible, not only on this case, but also on similar cases in Britain. And another lawyer based in Bombay. So these two persons helped me a great deal, and I ended up writing a book in 1998. Now, this is, 22 years, on her case. And that book is called Enslaved Daughters. Now, Enslaved Daughters is Rukhmabai's own expression about Indian women. And then, luckily for me, Ben Macmillan asked me if I would care to write a biography of this woman. और हिंदी में ही कह सकता हूँ, अंधा क्या मांगे दो आँखें. I couldn't ask for a better proposal paid for by Ben Macmillan. And early last year, the book came out. So this is the story of this remarkable woman, more of her later.
Thank you so much. Of course, he's given us some clues as to what you will find in the book. And yes, there is this constant moving between what is happening in India and what has happened in Britain, and how those two stories and strands actually interweave in the case of Rukhmabai's story. It's a very, very interesting and a very different relationship between Britain and India than we are used to hearing. So, Ida, over to you.
Thank you so much. First of all, I'm so thrilled to be here with each of you. So thank you, Kolkata Let Meet, and each of you for this opportunity. I'll talk a little bit about the research process as you brought up. I also spent an unreasonable amount of time in archival material, but that actually came a bit later. So I came to this project because I was working on a not unrelated project, but a different project about other kind of figures of yoga from North Calcutta. These were all men, and some relatively well-known, Yogananda, Paramahansa Yogananda, and others. And as I was working on that project, in conversation with people, the name that would come up every time was Reba Rakshit. And this was quite interesting to me, that in people's memories, this was the name that was alive. It was so remembered, it was so vivid. Nearly everyone that I would speak to, mostly in North Calcutta, but also elsewhere, knew of this woman, knew of her stunts. They would kind of light up when they spoke about seeing her in the circus or hearing about their parents seeing her in the circus, something to that effect. And at the same time, there was nearly nothing, I mean, really nothing written about her, except for one tiny obituary, and then later one very small essay, which I was never able to track down exactly how that essay got to where I found it. So I was kind of torn between this idea that this woman was very alive in people's hearts, in people's memories, but there was absolutely nothing really recorded. And so what to do about that? And so it was a very slow process of dreaming up this memory from these people's stories, trying to think about where I could locate her in history, trying to think about where the archive might give some hints, and trying to track down any family members, a lot of just word of mouth interviews and tools like that I had to put together. But this did bring up some challenges, like you say, about, trusting people's memories from decades back, and how much this is fact, how much this is imagination, how much this can be taken literally. Yeah, exactly, myth making. And so what I kind of came to was taking these stories at their word, and at the same time searching the archive or trying to find a different sort of piece of the puzzle that supported what these memories were bringing forward. And then by the time I would have enough pieces, let's say, to kind of support one memory or one story through the archive or through multiple accounts of the same exact detail, then that's when I put enough faith in it that, okay, I think we can go with this as her biography and as history. But also, one other difficulty about this is that she was a performer, and she was promoted by many people, circus companies, her guru Vishnu Ghosh, and many others who had a stake in embellishing her biography and her accomplishments. And that was something that I didn't want to include, were these embellishments. That I didn't want to say, yes, this is a biography, this is a fact, this happened, these little details, she was this beauty queen, she was this, usually they had to do with being beauty queens or winning certain awards that, that were embellished for the sake of promotion. So that I also had to navigate.
Well, on the question of the beauty queen, there is that little detail in the book where she is promoted as a beauty queen of 1950 something, but then of course you researched and said, okay, that was the year that actually there was no Miss India contest. So therefore they found a year where there was no Miss India contest and made her beauty queen Miss India of that year, so no one could actually refute it. So that's from there, can you talk a little bit about the tone of the book? Because it moves between first person, it moves between actually Reba, you're encountering her thoughts as well. You're encountering her thinking things, taking decisions in the first person. And often it's like as if you're there watching it unfold. So
That was the goal of the book for me, because when thinking about what tone the book should have, I really wanted to capture the fact that she was a circus performer. That is at least how most people knew her. And so I wanted it to sort of read as though you are watching this circus performance from the 50s. And that it was exciting and thrilling and a little bit scary and nerve-wracking. You weren't quite sure what you were going to see next. And at the same time, she was encountering that. She wasn't quite sure what was going to happen next. And she's most famous for the elephant stunt, for taking the elephant on her chest. Probably many of you know that. And, that was not a given that she would make it through that stunt every time. These were not tricks of the eye. These were full-grown elephants standing on this woman's body. So I wanted it to really read that the even anxiety or a bit of unsettling feeling that the audience had, that she also had that feeling. And at the same point, there's this celebrity, this kind of fame, this excitement. So to capture all of those elements of it and make it feel like you are watching the circus of this era was my goal for the book. Not that you were reading sort of an encyclopedia entry about her life, because that's not who she was to the public.
is there an excerpt you would like to read to illustrate that?
Sure. So she's about to take the stage. So when she reached the top, she steadied herself and took one breath. Inhale, exhale. Then she walked to the center of the platform. She wore a white leotard with white tights, so her whole body was covered in thin, tight fabric. The audience could see every action of her limbs as she moved. She had to look down at her own feet, afraid to lift her eyes towards the crowd who stared at her with great anticipation. The attention of the sea of strangers was resting on her, waiting for her to do something remarkable, to be remarkable. It was suffocating, but it was also very exciting. How often had she felt this type of attention? Never. She was just a young girl, yet an audience of all ages was watching her. As she stood pondering this, she could feel the nerves pulse through her body.
Thank you. And there's much more like that in the book. It really, it has so much tension. in these particular scenes. Of course, Ida, you had the opportunity to speak to people who remembered her, or who were her family members, and who could give you memories of that time. With Rukhmabai, of course, that was not possible because she's late 1800s into early 1900s, even though she lived a very long life. So I think in this book, when we come to the question of tone, there is a lot of archival material and quotations. And in terms of talking about myth making, because you also question that in the book, as to how other people have celebrated her in a certain kind of way in family histories, and giving us multiple perspectives of, and for us as a reader to make our own decisions. And I just want to read a little bit from Rukhmabai's own words, which is one of the letters she wrote to the newspaper, signed off a Hindu lady. And she's critiquing really the kind of life that she and her sisters, sisters not in siblings, but in terms of womanhood, are forced into at that point in time. And she says, for she's generally a mother before she's 14, when she must, of sheer necessity, give up the dream of mental cultivation and face hard realities of life. It seems therefore hopeless to expect any advancement in the higher female education when the custom of infant, or rather early marriage, continues as rife as before. Unless the state of things changes, all the efforts at higher female education seems like putting the cart before the horse. So this is the kind of clarity that she had of her position, and not just her position, but the position of women like her in society. So I would like to ask you to, because you do that so extensively in the book, to talk a little bit about what is this society of the time in Bombay, and the tensions that she is playing between. So if you could talk a little bit about that.
I can talk about society in general, but rather than do that, I would concentrate on Rukhmabai, and her story will give you an idea of the kind of society she was living in. She was 2.5 when she lost her biological father, and her maternal grandfather, that is Nana, he decided that he would not let his daughter remain a widow. So he kept in search of a suitable husband for his widowed daughter. Finally, about 6 or 7 years later, he managed to get an extraordinarily nice husband. And this man was Dr. Sakharam Arjun, a leading physician of Bombay and a social reformer. Please note, a social reformer who would write letters on women's education and say that normally by women's education we mean primary education. That would not do. We would have to provide higher education to women. Only then women's education would really become meaningful. So one would have imagined that Sakharam would be an ideal father for Rukhmabai. What happened? Now, please note that he is reformist enough to marry a widowed girl with a daughter. But when it comes to his own stepdaughter, now I say stepdaughter just to emphasize, otherwise Rukhmabai insisted that she got the love of a real father from Sakharam. Now, Rukhmabai was 11 when Sakharam married her off to a distant cousin of his. Now, 11, the social reformer marries off his daughter at 11. There is another aspect of it. Rukhmabai's mother had obtained some property from her first husband. And at the time of her remarriage, her second marriage with Sakharam Arjun, that property was transferred to Rukhmabai. Because they were afraid that the first husband's relatives would stake claim to that property after Jayanti Bai, Rukhmabai's mother's second marriage. So, to keep the property within the family, this transfer was made. Rukhmabai, of course, didn't know about it. And Sakharam, part of the condition of this marriage with his distant cousin was that he would stay as a ghar jamai. That Rukhmabai would not go to stay with him. He would come and start living under Sakharam's roof. This lasted a year, and after that, this good-for-nothing man, Dadaji Bhikaji was his name, he found this discipline of Sakharam a bit too much, so he went to stay with his maternal uncle. Now, this maternal uncle was a especially wild man. There were many wild men in Hindu society at that time, but he was especially wild in the sense that many Indian men, especially Hindu men at that time, would have their mistresses. But they would not let their mistresses stay in their house. This man made sure that his mistress would stay along with his family, and his wife once even attempted to commit suicide. Now I want to emphasize this, that here is a foremost social reformer of the period. He marries his daughter off at 11. Not only that, he withdraws the daughter from school. So Rukhmabai is denied education. Rukhmabai was purely an autodidact. Whatever she learned, whatever education she acquired, was on her own. Now, all this is fairly documented, but think of the state of that society. And when Rukhmabai writes these letters to the Times of India under the pseudonym A Hindu Lady, there's one point where she says, and I have been a victim of this. So Vikram, the point is that there were people who were making all kinds of noises. But when it came to practice, a vast shadow fell between their profession and their practice.
And I think that is not something that is only in the annals of history. I think that continues till today. And actually, Rukhmabai responds to that, I think, very strongly by insisting on legislation rather than waiting for social change to happen, but actually catalyzing some sort of change by enforcing a certain kind of legislation, which then becomes the norm over time. And she, I think, was very much a sort of flag bearer for that route till very late in her life. So, of course, all these details are there in the book. And what is remarkable about her, of course, as you were saying, she's an autodidact, not just to have go through education, but that she becomes, through her own efforts and goodwill of many people who joined her cause, both in India and in Britain, one of the very early women doctors in India. Um, and the fact that she heads two hospitals and sets up two hospitals in two not so hospitable parts of the country sort of is just underlines what a remarkable icon she was. But moving quickly on, I wanted to come back to you about there's a lot that you give in the book about the physical culture and the focus on developing physical culture as sort of socio-political identity building of that in Calcutta of that time, and not just in Calcutta but beyond. Um, and there's a lot, and you know, now in the city when we think of Shimla Bam Shomiti, and as you know, these are now we think of them as they're organizing Durga Puja, but the origins of those Bam Shomitis are of that time, and coming from a certain almost sort of trying to recapture or create a certain image of Indian identity, which is which which is strong, physically strong. It's also a point where nationalism is rising, etc. So there is that entire context. I'd just like to hear your thoughts about this equating of a strong body with a strong nation, and where does a woman sit in that?
I think they were trying to figure that out at this time, which is why you see women emerging into spaces during the late 1800s and early 1900s, early to mid 1900s, in a way that they weren't before, particularly when it came to the body and to physical practices. And the social reform, the question of social reform is very much at play in that conversation as well. It's, I think, been quite well researched at this point, the link between the social reform movements in Bengal and physical culture in Bengal, especially for men. So that this perception, this kind of colonial perception that was unfortunately dominating at this point of this kind of weakened culture, weakened masculinity, then had this tremendous response in the physical culture movements and in these akharas, and you know, this idea of bodybuilding, cultivating strength in a very literal way, that if you wanted to cultivate a strong nation, that meant strong individual bodies. And so quite literally you see this muscle control and bodybuilding movement of this time. So then the question really is about, okay, so how do the women fit into this? Because that was much about masculinity. What's been quite interesting to me, and it's a topic that I continue to look at, is that they were trying to figure out how does femininity, how does the woman's body, the female body play into this? And similar to what you were saying, it was very much in terms of this conversation of the nation, in terms of this conversation of how to support strong men, strong leaders, and this idea that if only the men are strong, you don't have a strong nation. You need to have the men be strong and the women be strong in order to support this strong nation, this strong culture, this strong identity. That's quite interesting, though, because it doesn't necessarily mean that you want women to have strength or women to be healthy. It means, for their own sake, it means that you want this to support the movement or to support the social reform or the ideas of nationalism at that point, whatever it might be, in a very specific way. And so you have the tension. Certainly Reba embodied this tension, and other figures, other women in this era. There's another woman that I've looked at a bit, Labanya Palit, who is another yoga practitioner in the 1950s, who are trying to define what this female identity is. What is a female identity that's part of a physical culture movement? And it's very much being defined as it goes. But one theme that I think is consistent is that it's supporting the home, it's supporting the family, it's supporting the husband, it's supporting the nation. And those lines are ever blurred, I would say. So is this about a healthy and strong home, a healthy and strong next generation, a healthy and strong nation, or a healthy and strong individual? Those lines are very, very blurred. And generally, I think it settles upon a healthy family and a healthy nation.
You have something to read for that?
Sure, I can kind of get to this tension around, is this practice then actually for the individual, or is it serving something else? I think you brought this up briefly in the introduction, Vikram, about who do these people belong to, and it's a question certainly literally in the marriage discussion as well, and property and all of that. So here's a passage about kind of Reba reckoning with this issue. So this is toward the end of her public career. But as it was, she could only resist for so long, since she was not in a position to fully determine her own fate. The circus companies put on such pressure, consistently saying that they could not do it without her. Also, Ghosh needed her to continue. She was bringing fame and notoriety to his college, which badly required both in order to flourish. She was a star performer who simply did not fully belong to herself. She partially belonged to the audience, who never had enough of her, the companies that promoted her, and the person who trained her. She signed on to perform in Siliguri and the cities that followed. She was venturing further and further from Calcutta. The pace of her life quickened with each success. So the idea is there's this kind of train in motion, or this career in motion, but where is she actually located in any of it?
Yes, and I think with Rukhmabai as well, that happened because when the case, she did have an early success with the first when the case first went to court, and then she lost subsequently, which is when she made that remarkable declaration that I will not obey the court's verdict. But there were people who came together to support her, the Rukhmabai Defense Committee, and she says before she leaves for England, she sort of, in her thanks to them, actually says that what we had set out to achieve, we did not quite achieve. So this sort of sense of something that she had set in motion, but which then got derailed by other interests and also by people running out of steam, perhaps. So maybe some comments of that part of.
Actually, this Rukhmabai Defense Committee is not quite a defense committee at the end. It lets Rukhmabai down. And I'll tell you the most important aspect of this case. When Rukhmabai lost in Bombay High Court, the idea was that her case would be taken to the Privy Council in London, which was the highest court of judicature for the entire British Empire. And no single individual could have afforded the expenditure of litigation in front of the Privy Council. So the idea was that the Defense Committee, Rukhmabai Defense Committee, would foot the bill. But then, one of Rukhmabai's 3 lawyers, Kashinath Trimbak Telang, a very remarkable person, he said that he would leave the Rukhmabai Defense Committee if the case was taken to the Privy Council. He said, this is a matter for the Hindus to decide. I am for reform, but I do not want the British to interfere in our affairs. It was bad enough that I had to fight this case. Ideally, I would have liked it to be settled by the caste panchayat. But that didn't happen, but I would not let it go too. So it's not only that, it's not quite that they are running out of steam. There are larger principles at stake here. And Telang prevails upon the Defense Committee. Now, to buy time, while means were being collected for the defense, for the appeal before the Privy Council, an appeal was filed in the Bombay High Court. They knew that nothing would come out of that appeal. The idea was to gain time. So when it became clear that the case would not be taken to this Privy Council, all parties got together. The British, Hindu Orthodoxy, social reformers, they all got together and managed to have a compromise in this case. The compromise was that Rukhmabai would give, now, not that Rukhmabai gave the money, someone else, that Dadaji Bhikaji, the husband, would be given 2,000 rupees. And in return for the 2,000 rupees, he would promise not to stake his claim as a husband. And this was a judicial decree. This compromise was a judicial decree, and the case ended. Rukhmabai, when she says this, it's tongue in cheek. When she's saying that what we had set out to achieve has not been achieved, she's saying, you made it impossible. She wouldn't have, in any case, she could have gone to London, pursued her medical course, and also follow this case. But once it was decided, so she decided to accept this compromise. She had no other option. And she really was a broken person when she had to accept that compromise.
And you see that also in many of the memories that other people have shared about her. Their first meetings with her, the kind of persona she came with, and the hint of sadness that she always carried and that people responded to. But just to go back to how radical these women were, just another thing that I want to read from the Rukhmabai book, which you underline. It's not, and this is, and I quote, not her refusal to cohabit with the man she was married to, but her refusal to recognize the marriage itself. That was what was radical. And she was one of the many women who refused to live with their husband, but she was the only one to disown the relationship. And going back to what you were saying about who do these women belong to, Rukhmabai had heralded a new conception of woman as a person. And I think that is something that, and I think when the blurb says that that idea of womanhood is yet to be fully realized, this is the idea of womanhood that is yet to be fully realized. I know it's ironic that Sudhirji and me, both as men, are saying that, but it is true. So I just want to draw this conversation to a close, and then if there are any questions, by asking both of you that they did take, we've heard something about Rukhmabai, but with Reba Rakshit, she belongs to many other agendas and many other people, but maybe one instance where she just took decisions into her own hand and, derailed that train from...
I think it was largely around leaving the circus and leaving her career. I struggled a little bit with what to do in this biography about the later part of her life, because I spent a long time trying to figure out sort of what she did and what happened after she left the circus. And I did find some things about that, but I ended up sort of closing the book a bit. This is a bit of a spoiler, but for the most part, wrapping up the book when she herself stopped her career. And I think there were perhaps some reasons why that happened that maybe weren't so, full of agency, I guess, things that happened to her. But I do also think that that allowed for her to have a different life in the second part of her life that was more as a person. And, she worked at some point, she had a job, she had her own apartment, she lived on her own. And I think that was quite a different existence than sort of belonging to the circus companies. So I do think there was this shift that she had some life left for her that was more of a human being, of a person who's trying to have connections, who's trying to have family, who's trying to exist and in connection with people. And that was a way in which she kind of had a bit of humanity.
So, this session is called Forgotten Foremothers, and there are two examples here. And I just want to, this is a rhetorical question, but to just open up this realm and this idea of Forgotten Foremothers, because really they did set the path for so many things to happen. We were talking yesterday about the day I became a runner, and the fact that that even exists today is because of people like Reba, Rakshit, who we would not know very much unless this book had been written. And when we're talking about Satyagraha as an idea that comes in so much later, and you look at the decision of Rukhmabai, taking that decision in a far more difficult and unsupported circumstances than Gandhiji was facing much later. And then you really, this idea of Forgotten Foremothers really has great potency. And they are both women about whom not much has been written. Now we have these two great books. And they're both from contexts which are not necessarily, in the annals of history. So, as a rhetorical question, in a world where we're moving towards more and more monolithic monocultures, very sort of this is the narrative kind of vein, how do we encourage more of these voices to be heard, to be written about, to be there at the table and insist on their presence? Yeah, let's imagine what could happen.
Well, I think it's a question which you should ask everyone. My own answer would be simple: by writing about them.
Absolutely, we're writing more books like this. What about you?
Yeah, I think there is a commonality between, finding this little piece of writing and then getting totally, for years and years, swept up in this story. I have a similar experience about hearing about this woman and thinking, who is this? Why is this so alive in people's minds? And I think that's really the key to it, to sort of being alert and paying attention to what is alive in history, whether it's in archives, whether it's in memory, wherever we might find it, and then sticking with that long enough. And there was one point in your introduction that I read that I thought was very interesting. This idea of a man writing about a woman and the tension there, and wishing that it were. I hope I'm saying this correctly, but wishing that it were a woman writing about a woman. I've had the same experience, being American, writing about a Bengali, and wishing that, it were maybe a Bengali writing, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that to a certain degree, while we are sensitive to those issues, it also takes somebody, sometime, talking about these people. So even if people are not a writer or not a researcher or not the right person for it, it doesn't matter at a certain point. At a certain point, if they're going to to kind of surface, then somebody has to do it.
Please, please.
Thank you for pointing that out. See, my wife is a fiction writer, and we've been together for very long, 45 years. And I have been with Rukhmabai longer than I've been with my wife. There's a 3-year difference. Rukhmabai came 3 years earlier than my wife did. Now, I'll tell you a little story. A Romanian naturalized French philosopher, Sanskritist, a real rishi. He and his partner, who is now my wife's French translator, so we were sitting in a cafe in Paris. And Charles, the philosopher, he asked me, so Sudhir, how has it been, your life with 2 women? I said, it's been wonderful, Charles. He said, wonderful? Lucky man? Are the 2 women not jealous of each other? Now, my wife is there. So I said, Charles, Gitanjali is here, my wife. So you can ask her if she at all felt jealous of Rukhmabai. And so far as Rukhmabai is concerned, she's been dead. And this philosopher, a Romanian, naturalized French, though a Sanskritist, he says to me, and how can you be so sure? Now I have no means of rationally tackling this question, except to say, but she's been dead. You said, so what? Now, this created a very different kind of perception in my mind, and I want to end this with a confession. And the confession is that being with these 2 women made it impossible for me to remain a man. I realized from within that I had to be androgynous. And I use the word androgynous in spite of the fact that certain feminists hate the word. I couldn't care less. Now, for decades I have struggled to be a woman. And I confess that with the best will in the world, I know I have not succeeded and I will never succeed. But at least the desire, the ideal. So I have done my best to be a woman while writing this book, and yet I know that I have not quite succeeded.
And yet the book is there. So I think that is a wonderful note to round off this conversation. And if there are any questions, please catch the 2 of them. They're around. And I would highly recommend that these books are read and shared. Not just read, but shared, because they're really, really, really... We can take questions now? Oh, okay. We can take questions now. 1 or 2, if there are any.
Hello, Ida and sir. I really found the 2 topics very interesting just when I saw them for the first time in the schedule. So thank you so much, first of all, for excavating these forgotten memoirs or forgotten memories, whatever we can call it, because these are things that, especially when they come from a community, be it a woman, be it a queer person, or be it a Dalit in India, they remain so much under the ground. It takes a lot of work to excavate that thing. So thank you so much to both of you for doing these labors and bringing those things in front of us. I just wanted to ask one particular question to Ida, and it's that see, the time of Reba Rakshit was almost coinciding with the time of the Indian nationalist movement, and even after our independence, that fervor, that tenacity, that momentum, that ideology obviously persisted. Although it was quite a bit damaged by the riots and everything, but still that fervor of nationalism, the new free India, was there. And as a part of that, during the 1910, 15, 20s, the development of Anushilan Shomiti and Jugantar and everything, this idea of physically empowering people, including women, because we know that there were women practitioners inside these samitis and all. So that idea of physically empowering people and including women, being connected to the idea of the nationalist movement. So how far do you think the nationalist movement and this whole fervor of nationalism in India at that point in time encouraged the production of someone like a Reba Rakshit? Do you think that Reba Rakshit could have been created or produced without that context? So your thought on that?
Well, first of all, I have to thank Rishabh so much because he's helped work on this book with me. So it would not be what it is without his help. So first of all, thank you for that. And also for the question. I think I have a slightly depressing answer for that, or cynical answer for that, which is no, not to the same extent. I think that this creation of sort of a national body mixed with an individual body was the driving force behind a lot of this. And I think the degree to which that was vocalized or brought to the forefront certainly varied, but the impetus for it, the driving factor for it, was the nationalist movements. And so I think that was absolutely the case in everything that I have come across. I think the question then is, what effect does that have for the individuals? If you are kind of thrust into a new experience, a new space, a new body, because of a certain force, does that force stay with you in your new experience? Or are you, experiencing a new body, a new practice, a new public space, and the reason for it is entirely separate? And that, I think, is complicated. So what actual effect it has on the individuals, that's complex. Are you just a cog in the nationalist sort of movement? I don't think that's the case. It's not that simple. But at the same time, it's certainly in the 20s and 30s, the women especially that were in new public space, in the physical culture movements, in the gymnasiums, that was, to my reading at least, absolutely because of the nationalist movements.
There's one at the back there and one here.
Hello, both of you. Thank you so much for the lovely session. I just wanted to ask, sir, while you were talking about the book and the amount of research you have put in, and how you were talking about being extremely, I would say, into the topic, into the research. So do you think when you get very personally affected by a certain character that you're writing about, the objectivity of writing it kind of gets lost, or is it the subjectivity of your involvement with the character that brings out a different truth, as it were? So that's my question.
See, I'm writing about my birthplace, my native town. My father joined government service when I was 8. So that is when I had to leave my native town. So this book of memoir would be about the first 8 years of my life. And I don't really know when the first memories I can't date back exactly. So suppose I was 4 or 4.5 when the first memories managed to surface. And while writing this book, I'm still in the process of, and I'm writing it in Hindi, because I know that this is a book I can never write in English, which is not my language. So I'm writing it in Hindi. And while it is a book about my childhood, I'm also standing apart. So this whole question of objectivity, well, one, it's a fraught question. We know, and I speak as a historian, that it's impossible. Consciously, I may liberate myself to a large extent, but what about the unconscious, the subconscious? So I'm not claiming objectivity of that kind, but that's something which would plague any writing. So it's always already there. You can do nothing about it. You can only aspire to be that. So when I write about Rukhmabai, my heart goes out to her. But even when my heart is going out to her, the historian in me is alert. So it's very difficult, but so long as you are conscious of it and you are trying to do your best, and you will, in this book, you will find that I have talked about my own biases, which actually worked against Rukhmabai. Because there's a part of this story when she got the news that her husband had died, the husband whom she had refused to own. Now, when she got this telegram in Surat that the man had died, she took on the widow's garb. Now, this is 1904. For the next 51 years that she remained alive, she continued to. Now this has been for me the most difficult part of this book. No, I'm not. No, how do I understand? No question of justifying. The point is not about justifying. How do I understand? So, your question is valid. There can be no definite answer to that. One can only aspire.
We had one more, and we'll take that as the last one.
Yeah. Sir, firstly, I really loved how you said that because of your association with two women, your character and your wife, you have androgynous traits, right? My question to you is, writers and people in general, shouldn't everyone possess them? Like, isn't it a better way to see the world and to understand people around them?
I couldn't agree more with you.
Sorry?
I agree with you. I agree with you.
So on that note of let us all work towards an androgynous world, let us end this session. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you to the Literary Meet, and see you around. And as I said, get these books and share them. Thank you.
Vikram.
You're very welcome.